Good afternoon, welcome to Dubai and welcome to MEED Live. My name is Richard Thompson, I am the Editorial Director of MEED. We have a special edition of MEED Live today. We're going to be focusing on public-private partnerships in the Middle East, PPP. This is one of the hot topics of the moment. It's part and parcel of the economic reform programme that we're seeing across the region in response to the downturn in oil prices. And in terms of project delivery and project finance, PPP is probably the hottest topic in town. I'm delighted to be joined today by three very expert panellists. So immediately on my left we have Richard Kupisz. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.
You're the Head of Utilities and Infrastructure at Maxwell Stamp, a management consultant.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you for joining us today. Next to Richard we have Debbie Barbour. You are a partner in the project finance practice at DLA Piper, one of the world's great law firms. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thanks,
and at the far end, Chris Seymour, who many of you will know from previous broadcasts. You are the Development Director at engineering consultant Mott MacDonald, and PPP is quite a big part of your activity.
It is indeed, yes.
So thank you, all of you, for joining us today. Why are we talking about PPP in this broadcast, and why are the guys here keen to talk about it? It's part of the new normal for project financing. The squeeze on government finances is forcing a rethink on how projects and public services are paid for and funded, and how can they reform the economic model in the region into a more sustainable, more productive, more efficiency-driven model. We're also talking about PPP because MEED has just published its latest research report on PPP in the Middle East, and so we have some new data that we can help shape the discussion on the PPP market. We estimate there are around about 156 active PPP projects in the pipeline, either being tendered or designed or procured at the moment. That's worth about $206 billion across the Middle East and North Africa. So we have a huge level of investment planned, but for everyone who knows PPP in the market, it's not simple. We've had a patchy track record, to say the least, of delivering PPP. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Perhaps I could start with each of you. Just let's see where you are in the PPP market. Richard, with you, you do a lot in Saudi, but what is your PPP agenda like at the moment?
Yeah, it's pretty busy. As you say, Saudi is certainly the most interesting market for us and most active for us at the moment. We're looking at currently the transaction advisor for the Ministry of Municipalities and Rural Affairs to do a PPP for municipal inspections in Mecca, which will be subsequently rolled out to the rest of the country. I'm also advising on a couple of smart city related PPPs for the Royal Commission of Jubail and Yanbu in Jubail. So a lot going on there, but also on the list is Oman, which have some things coming up on the pipeline right now. It's a bit of a pun there, since one of them is likely to be water and wastewater, but also electricity. They're looking. Oman's been quite active in IPPs, IPWPs in the past, and is now looking at the distribution sector as well. So quite active.
I mean, both of those are interesting markets. Saudi Arabia, we have the Vision 2030 reform programme and the national transformation delivery element of it for the next 5-year period. But there's also a lot of change. We've seen a sort of freeze on spending in the past couple of years in Saudi Arabia, a lot of change at the top levels. Is there a sense, do you get a sense that things are, we've passed the worst and things are now being put in place, that we can expect to see some growth of projects coming to the market, for example?
Well, I think some of the building blocks have been put in place. I think the enthusiasm, the desire to make progress and to make change is definitely there. There are still, I think, some major building blocks that are in development. One of them being the government procurement law, which, as in most of the countries in the region, in fact around the world, was designed for government to buy stuff. And that doesn't really work so well when you're doing a PPP project where somebody else is actually paying for the stuff you're buying.
Well, maybe that's a good theme to switch to Debbie. So you're a partner at DLA Piper, specialising in project finance. So the law is what you do. I mean, perhaps you could touch on what Richard has just raised about the need for legislation to help us deliver PPP.
Yeah, certainly that's been one of the criticisms of the GCC in the past that the procurement laws don't particularly work for PPP models, and I think that's quite true. I think you have to remember that in some Commonwealth countries like the UK and Australia, they've had a PPP model for years without a PPP law. So I'm not convinced that is the sole reason for projects on a PPP basis not going ahead. But I think the governments in the region have been addressing this. So we've seen Dubai introduced a PPP law in 2015. Both Dubai and Abu Dhabi brought out regulations in December last year to ease that process. We're seeing PPP laws potentially being introduced after summer in Qatar and Oman, I think it is, and Kuwait's had a PPP law. They're actually up to their second round of PPP laws. So I think it's something which governments are addressing, and hopefully it will set a framework to encourage projects to be procured on a PPP basis.
And as a project finance lawyer based in the Middle East, or based in Abu Dhabi, where does PPP, what's the sort of trend you're seeing with PPP? Has there been this escalation in PPP projects that you're dealing with in the past couple of years?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing which Richard, you touched on is that it depends also what you call a PPP contract. So we've been, like most law firms in the UAE, very heavily involved in the power sector. I think a lot of those are actually done on a PPP basis, even though the IPPs and the IWPPs are done on a PPP basis. So we have a model, certainly in the UAE, which has been successful for power projects. And what we're seeing now is certainly a move by authorities to try and move that towards infrastructure. So we've recently advised an authority in Dubai on its template PPP contracts, for example, devising some templates which can then be rolled out, hopefully, for a PPP program later on in this year or next year.
Okay, thank you. And Chris, Mott MacDonald, I mean, you one of the world's biggest multidisciplinary engineering firms, so you guys must have been involved in PPPs in just about every country. For someone who's head of business development in the Middle East and South Asia, what does it look like as a growth market? Is PPP top of your agenda?
I would say absolutely. I think from a regional perspective, Saudi Arabia is the biggest market, always has been, and it's certainly the biggest market as far as PPP is concerned. But it's not alone. The UAE is also important. Kuwait, we've already talked about Oman, and also Bahrain as well. And we're seeing this across. It's a broad sector basis, really. So it's yes, it includes healthcare and education, but also water, wastewater, and power is also still there. There is no doubt that the region is very familiar with the power and water deal. Classically, that is a PPP. When we're looking at the more the built assets around education and health, then I guess that familiarity is less, and that's probably where most of the discussion is around in terms of how these deals are actually structured. In other parts of the world, they've kind of got over that hump. They've got through the pain, and the deals are now much more fluid and can get the efficiencies out. We're yet to get there in this region.
Okay. Well, thank you all for that introduction and for being here again. As I mentioned, one of the pegs for doing this broadcast is MEED has just published some new research, which I will present some slides with some data throughout the broadcast today, and we'll use that to frame some of the conversation. But there should be a screen appearing in front of you at the moment to tell you a little bit more about the report. And if you want to find out about the report, please use the contact details on the screen. I think before we start getting into the data about the size of the market, the number of projects and things like that, I'd like to start perhaps by defining what do we mean by PPP, because it's a bit of an open description. And in the slide that should be appearing on the screen now, I've drawn this continuum. We've got from one end of the spectrum, it's about full government control. The traditional government spends the money on a turnkey contract, and at the other end we have the privatisation, where the full risk is taken up by a private sector partner. So PPP is somewhere in the middle. Perhaps, Debbie, if I start with you, what are we talking about? What do we mean when we say PPP?
Gosh, it's a debate that I think we've had in many jurisdictions. And I think a lot of things in this region get called PPP, which certainly from an English law background, I might not call it PPP. So I was in Saudi a couple of weeks ago, and there was talk about PPP of football clubs, and I think what was meant was privatisation of football clubs.
Right.
If I was to come up with a definition, and I think it's one that perhaps you'd agree with, is that it would be the provision of public services by the private sector. And Richard, I know you've got some views as to how long that might be.
So, I mean, I guess for anyone watching this broadcast who presumably is interested in business opportunities, or does it actually matter what's a PPP and is this just something that it's a buzzword, but actually every contract's different?
Well, yes, there are some standard models that have been developed, as we were saying, in places like the UK, Canada, Australia, which have been doing this for 20 odd years, and also in power, particularly in this part of the world too. But for most of the rest of it, PPPs are definitely case by case. You cut your cloth to suit the needs of the particular project.
If we have in say Saudi, we have the new National Centre for Privatisation, or in Kuwait we have the Kuwait Authority for Private Partnerships, and there are these PPP units being created. In addition, as Debbie, you said, we have these PPP laws as well in some countries. Does that ring fence this type of contract under those entities or those regulations?
Usually the law, and you probably have more experience of these things than I do, but the PPP laws generally will have a definition of what a PPP is.
Okay.
In practice, each country is different. One of the areas where, and I agree, by the way, my rule of thumb for a PPP is whenever you get the private sector doing something that traditionally the government has done. But a more formal definition, such as the one the World Bank has adopted, would include something about the length of time. So PPPs are usually temporary but long term, at least 10 years. And I've seen road contracts that last for 99 years. And the other thing is about risk. And if you really wanted to boil it down to one thing, it's PPPs are about the sharing of risk between the public and private sector.
Okay, so a privatisation is where something is taken from the public sector, from the government, and goes to a private owner who's responsible for everything.
Yeah, forever.
Yeah. And the traditional model is everything stays with the government and they just have a contract for a services. So we're talking somewhere in the middle. Usually it involves some sort of KPIs or measurement of services as well for a concession period. And beyond that, we can call it what we like, BOT, BOO. Okay, so hopefully that we know what we're talking about. If you want to get involved in this conversation, if you have some opinions on, I'm sure all of you will have opinions on what PPP is, how it works, if it's a valuable model for the region, and some of the challenges, please use the screen in front of you. There is a text field below the screen window. Send in your questions. They will come up on our computer here, and we can discuss them and try and answer your questions as we go. So if we can look at some of the data then from the MEED report on PPP in the Middle East and North Africa, I want to start by looking at the PPP pipeline and looking at the different country markets. We have already heard from the panellists about the importance of Saudi Arabia, for example. Now we have found in our research there are currently around 156 PPP projects that are in the market. This does not include the ones that have already been awarded and that are in their operational phase. This includes projects that are under study, under design, under procurement, or perhaps have been reached financial close and are at that early construction phase. So Saudi Arabia is by far the largest country in terms of the value of PPP projects in its pipeline, with around about $42 billion worth of PPP projects across all sectors. This does not include, however, IWPPs and IPPs, which, for the purposes of this discussion, are a well-established model. Does that make sense to you guys? Is Saudi Arabia where it is, Chris?
Yeah, I think absolutely. That's the largest pipeline. I think the point to make is that this kind of information for would-be private sector participants is extremely important. bidding for any PPP is expensive, and as you start that bidding process, you may think that you've got a great win theme, but ultimately you may not. And so you need to make sure that where you're committing in a geographic sense, and probably a sector sense as well, there is that realistic pipeline behind it. It isn't, you are not just there for a single project. The private sector participant is never there just for a single project. There has to be more. And so I think the publication of the pipeline and the reality behind it, which we're now seeing from the government, is really important, not just for the private sector, but also from the government, because this means they're actually going to get interest from it. And this is so from this perspective, this is important. In terms of Saudi being the biggest, absolutely. I think that the UAE was not far behind.
Yeah. So UAE, we have it's fifth on the list that I have here, but I would like to make the caveat that Libya, which is number 2 on the list, actually is skewed by a huge project in Tobruk, which is Chinese funded, about $36 billion.
Yeah. So
I think we should ring fence Libya. That means our front 4 are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Morocco, and the UAE.
Yeah.
That's what your experience is. And in Saudi Arabia, Richard, Maxwell Stamp has a big presence there, and Is it across all sectors the PPP model that is being used, or are we seeing it mostly in housing or in healthcare?
No, I think it's across all sectors. The NTP has stimulated all ministries to identify potential PPPs and to really work hard on getting them through the posts. The concern that people may have about this is basically it's like when you've got a football crowd leaving the stadium. You've got a certain number of gates to get through, and everybody's trying to get through the same gate at the same time. In the case of PPPs, it's about the financing. It's about investors. There are only a certain number of global investors who have the appetite to do these things. There are a certain number of capital available at banks, and the other point that.
So what does that mean? You're saying that there are certain projects that can go ahead faster because they're easier to.
Well, everyone. The risk is that you're going to hit a bottleneck with everybody trying to get the same limited resources at the same time.
Is that what you see, Debbie? That there's too much coming at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to the point that Chris made as well, that in terms of investors coming in and looking for which projects to back. And there has been a track record in this region of projects not going ahead, and bidders spending a lot of time and money on projects which don't go ahead. So I think bidders and international sponsors, international banks will be looking for those projects which they think have got a really strong chance of going ahead and being successful. And we know that capital is restricted. We know that liquidity is an issue for local banks, so it is so important to attract those international lenders as well. And to do that, the projects have to be well structured.
Okay, now if we can just, before we get into some of the other slides, we've got Kuwait here as the second biggest PPP market. I don't know which of you has most experience in Kuwait, but Kuwait's been pushing PPP for quite a long time, first through the Partnerships Technical Bureau and then through CAP, the Kuwait Authority for Private Partnerships. But a lot of people find Kuwait frustrating. There's a lot of, it's easy to drop a long list of PPP projects, but are they coming forward? I'm looking at you, Christy. Is there, what's your sense of momentum in the PPP sector for Kuwait?
I think it's quite strong. There's no doubt that Kuwait took the plunge, if you like, into the PPP market when oil prices were still quite high, and so we have to respect them. This a few issues were encountered. They reevaluated, changed a few things, and CAP emerges. So we really do respect Kuwait for getting that far, and to that extent, they're probably further ahead down the track of getting the right policy framework in place than maybe the UAE.
Is your sense that some of the barriers to getting PPP projects moving in Kuwait in the past under the previous under the PTB, was that because oil prices were still high? They didn't need to change anything, so the political will wasn't strong enough, but now we're in a different dynamic, so things are different. Is that
there is a need there. I think although Kuwait also is their break-even oil price is almost where it is now, actually. So from a regional context, they're in quite a good place. I think there's also been a stabilisation in the political climate in Kuwait, which has allowed the deals in a more long-term sense go ahead. So I think it is an important market for PPP, and probably slightly more mature than others. Yeah.
Okay. We can come back to the different countries. Let's move on to another slide for the moment. So the next slide is a pie chart showing the region's PPP pipeline. So this is the $206 billion worth of projects, 156 projects, where they are in the delivery cycle. So we have approximately 120 billion, according to our research, have been awarded. So they've reached financial close, and the consortium or the lead private sector partner has signed a contract with the government to take on the project, and perhaps has even started in the construction phase. So that's about half. About $63 billion worth, maybe $67 billion if I include design and study together, are still at the pre-tendering stage. So that is around about just below one third, maybe 30%. They're at the pre-tendering stage, and another $32 billion worth are under tender. So I think on the basis of cash flow, if you like, or workloads, we've got more that's under study and under tender, under study and design than are currently being tendered. So that suggests we can expect an increase in the tendering process. I mean, Richard,
in fact, I would say that even understates the opportunities coming up, because we're seeing news reports like in Saudi saying we're going to do PPPs or privatise all our airports, hospitals. I know that Oman is looking at privatising the electricity sector, electricity distribution, also restructuring and doing PPPs in the water sector. So stuff, I'd probably call them pre-studies, because they're more like the strategy, sector strategy.
It's actually a little bit difficult to use the traditional stages of procurement for PPP, because actually it's about offloading all of that to your partners. So. But I guess the main point is we have this pipeline of 206, and around just over half is at a fairly advanced stage, and there's still half going, but we know there's loads coming.
Yeah, I think there's a bulge coming up over maybe in the next sort of 3 to 5 years, that they'll suddenly be moving at least into the study stage, whereas those studies, many of those will move into the tender.
I just wonder though, perhaps Debbie, if I come to you, in that Richard made the point earlier that one of the challenges in Saudi is having all of this stuff coming at the same time, and so there's a demand for financing, there's a demand for skills, and perhaps a bottleneck. So if we have this surge coming that Richard just mentioned, are you concerned that actually we're going to hit a wall of delivery?
Yeah, I think that's always a risk. A lot of it, I mean, when you look back to the UK in 1997, the first projects were always the hardest, and then they became streamlined, so there wasn't so much of a risk. As people got used to the risk allocation, there was less negotiation.
That seems to have happened in the airport sector in Saudi Arabia. We in the past 6 months, we've had about four.
Three,
well, there was one before, and then three in the past 6 months, yes, so there's about 4 in total now. And TAV has been one of the main players. So is that an example of what you mean? Once
I think it is, or closer to home, look at the DEWA projects, where you've seen those just roll off, and very standardised risk allocation now. You look at the documents, and from a lawyer's perspective, they're quite similar to the ones which were signed last time round. So there is a kind of well-trodden path now, and lenders are comfortable with that risk allocation. We know they're bankable.
So in terms of that smoothing the path to getting projects off the ground, where and let's focus on Saudi Arabia for the moment, just because it's the biggest the biggest segment. Where are we in terms of templating these models and smoothing out the road bumps on the path? Obviously, around Saudi Electricity Company and the IWPPs, that's well established, and I guess the National Water Company doing the wastewater treatment plants is fairly advanced as well. But what about outside of that, healthcare, education, transport?
I think we're still in the formative stages almost, that we haven't seen PPP in healthcare in Saudi, and yet that's certainly being discussed. So I think that what we probably will see is once one project goes ahead, then we will see. I'm not as worried about the bottleneck, because I think once you have something go through and there's a model that people can look to, particularly if it's a successful model.
So is this why so in Saudi Arabia, but we've seen it in other countries, we have the National Centre for Privatisation in Saudi Arabia, so this new entity that's going to provide the capacity or the bandwidth to do this. That's the job, is it?
Absolutely, and we see that with CAP as well in Kuwait. And the idea is these PPP units are being set up, and the idea is to staff them to help smooth these projects.
But in Kuwait, I don't want to pick on one country against another, because I think that's probably not right, but I think that Kuwait's a good example of where it doesn't necessarily mean that because you've created the unit, you're going to suddenly see...
and I think my understanding certainly of CAP is that they are engaging more people because they've realised that so much work is involved, they needed to make it larger to cope with the workload. So I think that's obviously an important... Just because you've got a PPP unit doesn't mean that the projects will go ahead. They need to be properly staffed as well.
Yeah. And Richard, from your work in Saudi Arabia, so I know that Maxwell Stamp has an active office there in Riyadh, so I guess you know the National Centre for Privatisation quite well.
Yes, indeed.
What is it trying to achieve at the moment? What are its challenges at the moment, and what are its objectives? Are these clear?
I think that one of the challenges is to actually get a proper framework in place. As I mentioned,
is that a legal framework? You mean?
Well, a legal and a process framework, and to decide on the overall governance of the PPP program, because there are various different models. In some countries, you would have the national centre is almost like central planning. We're the guys who do all the PPPs. You come to us, and we'll decide whether you can do it. In other countries, the national centre is basically just for setting a framework, and each ministry will have its own. And there are all sorts of models in between those two. And at the moment, it is being done on a more decentralised basis. So while the National PPP Centre is there, and they are the ultimate arbiter, I guess, well, the Privatisation Council, in fact, on PPPs, each ministry is establishing their own PPP units and centres, which goes some way, I think, to addressing the point you made about skills, because it's not just going to be one unit in the centre saying we need to invest, we'll hire 10 people. It's going to be half a dozen ministries all saying we're going to hire 10 people and train them up. So that might help to address some of those problems. And it also means each sector is different, and with ministries responsible for driving their own PPP programs, then they will have that specific expertise. So the water guys will know the specifics down to water, electricity will know the specifics of electricity, and so on and so forth.
So Debbie mentioned that in the case of Kuwait, it was one of the things that's going on is building that capacity, getting more resources in. Is that all it's about? And presumably there's a political element to it, which is when you have this PPP unit over here and it's dealing with ministries that are, they have processes in place for a traditional model. So presumably there's that. They need political clout to be able to affect change.
Yes, political will is one of the necessary conditions for any PPP to be successful. And the risk in so many countries, particularly emerging markets, you'll get a donor coming in like the World Bank and saying, right, we're only going to lend you money if you do PPPs. So, okay, grudgingly they'll set up this PPP centre. This happened to me in the past with privatisation. I was part of the Tanzania privatisation programme, but they were literally there was no political will. So you'd get so far, and projects would just get blocked.
And political will, that means somebody who actively takes responsibility for driving a champion.
Yeah, you need a champion,
and it's not just a minister, or
usually yes, and it's not necessarily a champion for all PPPs, but for large PPP projects, you need somebody up there in the Economic Council or Cabinet or whatever who is willing to speak out. I don't know, Chris.
I suppose just picking up on that, I don't personally think that there there will be a bottleneck as such, because I think that a lot of the deals that are going through are the ones that there is a high degree of familiarity, particularly in Saudi at a government level, and we're talking about the water and the power deals. The airport deal which we're involved with got out of the blocks very quickly, but we need to remember that there was already a template for that, which was Medina, and so maybe we shouldn't be surprised on that. I think what the supply chain's got to understand is some of the deals relating to social infrastructure like healthcare and education are going to take longer. Even in developed markets, it will take at least 18 months to get a hospital PPP off the ground, and so if we're talking about them now in 2017, you're probably not talking about until 2019 when these are actually going to be built. And so yes, there's a lot of consultancy going along, there's a lot of noise about it, but in terms of actually awards for capital work and seeing that push through into the supply chain, I think we've got a few we've got a few years to go yet. And these the heavy infrastructure ones, the ones that are where the template is much more familiar, will be first will be first to run. Okay. I think the other thing that you mentioned, Richard, around the PPP unit, creating the policy framework is exactly their job. What we quite often see is, even when that policy framework is created, you have a national ambition, but you have local needs, and so you have municipalities at a local level wanting to put a project away to deliver a project at a local need that may not translate to the national agenda, and you quite often end up with tension between the two. And so, but we are yet to see that. The NCP is only just in place, of course.
Okay. We can. I invite you to submit questions and make observations using the screen in front of you. We have a question here which I think follows on from your point, and I think it's going to require us to go around the countries a little bit. So the question is, would it be possible to discuss the changing legal frameworks around PPPs in the region? So this relates to just what you've been saying, Chris. What countries have recently passed new PPP laws, and what countries wish to do so? And are there any sectors that the panelists consider particularly ripe for PPPs? So I have a slide in a moment on the sectors, but let's deal with the first bit. Perhaps Debbie, as the lawyer in the team, we can start with you. If I go through this list of countries, so Saudi Arabia, PPP law or no PPP law?
No PPP law, but
actually,
PPP unit.
If you don't know the answer, feel free to say.
No PPP unit, but no, effectively, but no PPP law.
Are they planning a PPP law?
Not as far as I'm aware. I don't know, Richard, whether you're aware.
There's a royal decree that was expected in July, but is still on its way, which will not. I don't think it's going to be as detailed as a PPP law, but it will start setting some of the framework issues, such as what procurement regulations, or how can do you have to stick with the government procurement law, or are there other ways of doing things? So yes, it's very early stages, I think, there.
Okay. So the report from MEED that I mentioned at the beginning of the show does detail the status of the legal framework in each country, as well as the organisations responsible for driving PPP. So if we miss any countries, it's in the report. Let's move on. I'll skip Libya for the reasons that we mentioned before, largely because that's in a different phase, I think. But Kuwait, they have the CAP, the Kuwait Authority for Private Partnerships. Do they have a PPP law?
And they do have a PPP law.
They're actually on to their second.
They are, as Debbie says, they're on their second law. And I think the point that Debbie made earlier, you don't have to have a law to have PPPs. Take the UK as an example.
Does it help? I'm guessing it does.
It helps in terms of giving the private sector confidence that this is going to happen. It pretty much mandates that form of procurement, and it can also set framework and structure, and the private sector will understand more clearly the ambition of the government. So I think that's a good thing. I think something that we probably should mention is that all the while the Middle East and GCC has been building assets and operating assets on a very traditional basis. Something's picked up in your report as well. You have Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan. They are old hands at this, and and I'd include Oman in that as well.
The ones that aren't oil exporters.
Exactly. They've always had difficulties around cash and have had to look at more sophisticated methods of creating infrastructure. So there's a large amount of experience in those nations. In fact, I think the first deal was actually in Oman in 1984, which is a long time ago. And so that experience is already there. For the GCC, this is new territory, and I think that's the difference.
That's the key issue.
Yeah.
Okay. The UAE, we have a PPP law in Dubai.
We have PPP law in Dubai. We don't have one in Abu Dhabi. We have regulations which came out in December, which were basically internal regulations as to how to procure projects, but they've also been made available. And we had regulations come out in Dubai as well in December, I think, last year or so.
And so the regulations in Abu Dhabi, do they cover the entire UAE or just the Abu Dhabi Emirate?
Yeah.
And the Dubai regulations are just Dubai. Yeah. What about the rest of the Northern Emirates, for example?
No PPP laws. Obviously, they've all got procurement laws. And Richard, as you said before, sometimes some of the difficulties, the technical difficulties that we come across are trying to fit projects into a traditional procurement model. Again, I don't think that's fatal. I think, Chris, as you were saying, I think introducing a PPP law is a really strong sign to the market that, yes, we're open for business in the PPP sector. And sometimes it will help to alleviate any concerns that investors or banks might have by saying, yes, we recognise this model. I don't think it's crucial to have these laws.
Well, the Medina airport that you mentioned, that was done in Saudi Arabia without any PPP.
Indeed. Yes, that's right. And its success then triggered really the look that GACA had on the rest of those assets. And
you
5 of them.
So we had Medina first, and it was placed and developed, but then the next one along was Taif, I think.
Yeah.
And it didn't immediately succeed.
No. And I think the reason that Saudi Arabia has been a great testing ground for the aviation PPP is because there are many regional airports where this type of procurement could in fact be tested on the ground, and Medina was the ideal. TAFE didn't work quite so well, but it is now being pushed forward. I think the good thing is that for aviation PPP in Saudi Arabia, we're now looking at three different options that they've actually used, and that shows that there's a consideration of value for money, not just because there's a lack of cash. And that's really the important point. As many people say, a lack of cash is probably the worst reason to choose a PPP. You've got to really focus on the value it's actually going to play back. And so when we see that the GACA have actually adopted 3 different options for those 5 airport privatisations, I think that's a good sign that there's a realisation of that.
And GACA, of course, has 27 airports, Indeed. And it's committed to privatising them, which I guess is PPP falls under that umbrella, by 2020.
Indeed, and then that's quite a racy programme.
So that's 27 airports.
Indeed.
4 have gone, and there's 23 more to.
Yeah, and I suppose again it probably goes back to what the definition of the PPP. Yeah. And let's be clear that 3 of those airports were PPPs as we would expect. TAV a consortium, we got 2, and then CCC the 3rd. There's 2 of them were actually privatised. The airport company was privatised, and then the other option is actually a long-term operating agreement.
So that's what they have in Jeddah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Now that is under the umbrella of the GCC definition of PPP, if you like. So if using that, then that target looks more realistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should count O&M under our first slide classification. O&M is traditional.
Yeah.
So okay. Maybe we don't want to go through the full list, but Bahrain is an interesting one. Debbie, have you been looking at Bahrain at all? Do you know much about it?
We've looked at bits of Bahrain. They were looking at a bus PPP, I think, last year.
And
they
they've pushed the housing for quite a long time.
The housing one as well.
Yeah,
which again, there's a debate as to whether or not that's a true PPP or not. But but it's certainly.
Sorry to interrupt. One of the sort of the flagship projects in Bahrain is the Causeway, the second causeway between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. How does that? And they're talking about that as a PPP. When you've got two countries involved, does that make it extra complicated?
It can do. Look at Eurotunnel.
You smile there, obviously.
I'm just smiling because I worked on Eurotunnel a long time ago, and trying to reconcile two different legal systems was quite complicated. It can do. From a point of view of people who think there might be business opportunities for them, does that mean they should have a sort of warning flag that if they're pursuing that project, it could take a bit longer than expected because you've got different jurisdictions Potentially.
involved?
That's going to be a huge project, so I think it will take a bit longer than expected anyway. But I think, there's a lot of, we were talking before about political will. I think that's a project where there would be political will, and I wouldn't get too hung up about the fact that there's two different countries.
I guess for something like that project, it's very politically driven, isn't it?
There will be cooperation agreements that work together on it.
Okay. I won't go through everything. Egypt features quite strongly in terms of it's been talking about PPP for a long time, and they have the PPP unit within the Ministry of Finance. It's had all its problems with currency crisis and security issues, etc. Maybe if I start with you on this one, do you look at Egypt at all, Richard, and where does that play? Is that an attractive market?
We do. I think it would be more of a struggle, although in some ways more of a blank sheet of paper as well. So there are swings and roundabouts. One of the benefits, at least from my role as an advisor, is that there are people like the World Bank, Islamic Development Bank. There are more donor funds coming, which are much less risky for us to fund the advisory role. And donors do tend to push for things like laws and all that sort of thing, and having people well trained and having proper PPP procedures in place. Okay. So from the role of the advisor, at least, possibly you could say it's lower risk, but from the point of an investor, then that could be something different.
Now, if I move on I want to get to the end of my slides, having prepared them. So we move on to the PPP pipeline by sector. So I've tried to classify by sector, and we can see housing is the biggest segment, and that's dominated by some mega projects in several countries, but Saudi is one in particular. Perhaps, Debbie, if I start with you, is housing, does that raise any particular challenges when you're trying to put together a commercial model or a bankable project? Is housing more difficult than a road, for example, or a railway?
Potentially. I mean, it often will come down to who the off-taker is, what the payment stream is, how payments are going to be made. A power project's generally fairly easy. You have a single off-taker, fairly simple kind of risk analysis to do. Housing, depending how it's structured, can be more complicated. So certainly from a legal perspective, that throws up risks which then need to be covered off.
And the next group, so I have a group of projects which I've segmented out into rail, ports, and airports and highways, but under the broad term of transport, that's probably the biggest single sector. Now, transport PPPs have got a patchy record, haven't they? Even not just in this region, rail PPPs in the UK have struggled. We've had roads out here. So what are the issues around transport? Let's put airports to one side because we've just talked about that, but what are the challenges with roads and railways?
Roads are really interesting because roads, people are used to driving on roads without having to pay for them quite often. So I think as soon as you introduce a payment mechanism, a tolling mechanism, for example, for a road, that raises public policy issues, particularly for users who are not used to paying for travelling on roads. If you look at the UK or Australia, where toll roads are quite common, perhaps not the same political issues necessarily. Having said that, I think from the government's perspective, we haven't seen a lot of availability-based PPPs, and so the idea of the government paying for 25 years an availability charge is quite a new concept in this region as well. So I think transport, roads have their own challenges because of that mindset that asking the government to pay for something. And don't forget, when you look at a PPP, there's often a belief that PPP is cheaper than traditional procurement. But when you look at PPPs, the way they're structured in terms of, if it's a 25-year PPP and you've got 25 years of debt payments which have to be taken into account, and 25 years O&M which needs to be taken into account, you're not really comparing like for like. So PPPs can seem expensive when you look at them if you go out for a 25-year concession road, for example.
But the most famous sort of road PPP attempted in this region was the Mafraq-Guaifat highway, which is through Abu Dhabi to the Saudi border, and that was going to sort of break new ground, and it didn't get delivered as a PPP. Was that because of the public policy issue or the cost? What have we learned from that?
Yeah, there's a lot of theories on that one. I think one of the issues was that it was just hugely expensive. It was it went out to market in 2009. The cost of that road, and I know that Mott were involved as a technical advisor on that, it was a very complex highway. It was 327 kilometres from Abu Dhabi to the border of Saudi.
So is that one of the, so with say the Saudi Land Bridge Railway, which was an east to west railway right across Saudi Arabia, I can't remember how many billions of dollars, but that also failed to get off the ground as a PPP. What I heard was that it was the complexity of the sheer engineering challenge of that. You couldn't include it all in the risk, allocate the risk in a contract. Is that what the problem is with these big long distance transport projects?
I think certainly that was one of them, and I must admit I'm not fully up to speed with the technical issues, but when I did speak to engineers, we were acting for one of the bidders in that project. When I did speak with the engineers, they said it was a very challenging project because of the specifications. It was a very ambitious project, I think, to lead with as a PPP, as a transport PPP in the region. Just the sheer size of it made it quite ambitious.
I presume you come from an engineering background, Chris, as a Mott MacDonald representative, but is that...
Yeah, I think Debbie picked up on two crucial things here. One is one of the challenges we have in the region is the familiarity with the revenue-based model and the lack of familiarity around an availability-based model. And when you get a project which doesn't work in a business sense on the basis of revenue, be it whether it's tolls, whether it's power or any other aspect, or maybe even water down a pipe, then you have to look at an availability basis. And that is where we're in new territory. And so I think that where you have a project which has extremely ambitious in technical content around engineering, where, if you like, the business case just wouldn't work, you have to look at it in an availability sense, and then we're in new territory. The risks are very different, and sometimes we see time march on.
So with the big long distance projects, then say the land bridge in Saudi or the Mafraq-Guaifat highway, can we expect to see those parcelled up? So we hear about TODs, transport-oriented developments in Dubai. We have Union Oasis. Is that the way
that's potentially a way of doing it, parcelling it up so the whole thing has less ambition and actually looks a lot more achievable. I think this is one of the challenges around social infrastructure, where hospitals and schools pretty much have to be done on an availability basis, and as I say, this is really new for the region. It's a new method. So what the government there is doing is paying for accommodation that is available for use, rather than the revenue that it derives. The payment mechanism is completely different. The risk transfer is also completely different. And the other point that Debbie made was actually around affordability. And this was an extremely large challenge in the UK and in Europe, where if you actually test the affordability of the deal, bearing in mind the private sector is the one that's borrowing the money, usually at a higher rate than the government would borrow the money, when you actually test it on an affordability basis, it quite often comes out more expensive, which goes back to the point I suppose I was making, that it's not just about cash, it has to be about the benefit that you're actually getting from the risk transfer.
This was always the argument during the era of high oil prices. People were talking about PPP, and the argument was it isn't about saving, it's about knowledge transfer or efficiency. Or
that's right, and I think if you look at the point that if you have to build a building which you've got to operate out of your own pocket, you're going to pretty much make sure that building is built correctly, and that is the efficiency in the economy that's passed on to the government at the point that the PPP is tendered. And that's less about cash, it's more about efficiency.
Yes.
That kind of is the big picture we're in now, isn't it? Moving from this input-driven growth model where it's about spending to get growth. It's about productivity now and efficiency. And I think PPP fits with that.
Very much so. I mean, we talk about PPPs as concessions. It's derived from a French word, which actually is related to output. It's all about output, not input. And I think that's the difference in around a PPP. Yes, it gets to the point where somebody in the end has to design it, but at the front end, it's about output. What does the client actually want out of the road, the bridge, the hospital, the school, in an output sense, and that's is the fundamental difference in PPP from traditional.
Now, if I can move on to my final slide, it's about. So we have had a look at MEED at about 80 PPP projects in the region and how they've performed, and we see that about half of them have been implemented as PPPs. Another 28% are continuing to move ahead as PPPs, and the remaining quarter or so have either been on hold, cancelled, or converted back into EPC conventional procurement models. So we have a quarter of PPPs that are launched haven't in the past reached close. If we look at the reasons for that, cost is one of the reasons that's attributed. Another is the deal structure. Political will is another reason, 6%, and then financing. So are those the four core reasons? Debbie, perhaps as a lawyer you see this more than anybody. So we've got costs, deal structure, political will, and finance. Are those the reasons? Are those the kind of things to be aware of if you're trying to get a PPP delivered?
Yeah, I think particularly deal structure. I think with PPPs, and we've discussed that they're not necessarily cheaper. So you are looking at risk transfer, and that's inevitably going to lead to a debate between the public sector and the private sector as to how that risk gets divvied up. And I think there's been sometimes some thought that if we do a PPP, all the risk gets transferred to the private sector, and that's not necessarily the most efficient way to do that. That sometimes some risks do sit better with the public sector, particularly when you look at jurisdictions in the GCC, where in the UK, for example, change in law, there's a fairly tried and tested way of divvying up that risk, change in law risk. You look at the UAE, for example, and look at how many laws have been introduced over the past couple of years. And if you're looking at a 25-year project, how do you allocate that risk? And I think that's a discussion which needs to be had to get the structure right, and a structure which is bankable and that investors are interested in.
So that it's from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a within the government side, the public side of PPP, there's a lack of perhaps understanding within the traditional ministries that that it's not just transferring everything to the private sector, and that's where we have to do a bit of educating.
I think it's certainly some of the early PPPs that we saw in the region, which didn't necessarily take off. What we did see was, and this probably advisors were as much to blame as anybody, was to bring a model which worked in the UK, for example, and plonk it down here. But
why wouldn't that work?
I think when you just look at some of the factors such as change in law, for example, when you're looking at a jurisdiction such as the UAE, where there's been incredible changes in law. I mean, VAT will be introduced next year, for example. So it's not just a matter of taking one set of documents and thinking they're going to work here. For example, in the UK, with some of the solutions to PPPs, when they go wrong, such as selling it off to another operator, if you don't have a liquid market here, those remedies are not going to work. So I think you can't just wholesale take another system wholesale and expect it will work here. So I think there's a bit of education on both sides, and for the advisors, to be frank, to think carefully about whether these models will actually work here and how to make them work.
And on the advisory side, I mean, what are the lessons learned? That where have we got it right and where have we got it wrong in the past?
Actually, going back to your slide, I would, as an advisor, tend to get brought in, not necessarily at the very beginning, but usually after government has decided, I'm going to do this project as a PPP. So a lot of that stuff that should have been done has not been done yet. And then we're given the job of basically running the tender through. Those reasons that you got, I would actually say they're more symptoms of an underlying reason. And that underlying reason for me is insufficient preparation and that has a whole range of things. It's for the specific project in particular. A lot of governments, I worked for governments for the last 30 years on different projects and even been in governments. And what seems to be typical for a government of any country, UK included, is they take forever to reach a decision. Once they've taken that decision, say to do a PPP, they then want to implement it within 5 minutes or even yesterday. And we were discussing this beforehand, and it's come up a couple of times as well. There is a huge pressure from my clients as governments to finish quickly. And in my experience, there are no true shortcuts in PPP. It's all about preparation. The more shortcuts you take at the beginning, the more time you're just adding on to your negotiation stage, the more risk you'll have that you'll never reach closing, or if you reach closing, you find you've picked the wrong guy and the economics don't work, or whatever it might be. So it's all of those things. There are so many examples. I was talking to an investor, a large global investor, just before in a meeting before this one, and we were discussing. He said, "Yeah, we're so used to seeing invitations to tender that where for a multi-million dollar PPP project where the scope is 2 pages long, and how can we put a bid? How can we work out the risks for this? Which means your whole bids are all caveated. It means you have to negotiate them forever."
So just before we were coming on air, Debbie, you were talking about bankability. Is that what Richard is talking about here? It's the detail that a bank wants to see?
Part of it, yeah, for sure. I mean, banks are going to, banks will always focus on what their risks are, and so they're going to need detail in order to do that. I mean, no bank can go to credit on a 2-page document, so absolutely they're going to.
Bank preparation, as Richard has identified,
absolutely
is key to bankability. Now we've only got a minute or so left, so I think we'll go to closing remarks. The time has gone a lot quicker than expected.
Time flies when you're having fun.
It does, exactly. I'll start with you, Chris. You've been quiet for a long time, so what are your thoughts? Are you optimistic about this pipeline converting into real projects that are going to underpin a recovery in the market?
Yes, fundamentally I am, because the projects themselves are real, and I think really all we're talking about here is a method of procurement. I think the most important thing, and we are seeing it emerge, is engagement of the private sector at a very early stage. So usually when you say, okay, what should you do first? You should first actually talk to the private sector. Is this deal something the private sector might want? Is it bankable?
So when
before
we say
you
talk
start
to the
writing
private sector,
RFPs?
do you mean banks or do you mean developers? Or
The government, actually. So so we're seeing invitations like solicitation invitations going out. This is a sign that the governments are realising that they need to engage the private sector right at the beginning. There's no point spending either government resources or consultancy resources on a deal that wouldn't work. The PPP units have a really big part to play in this. They should actually be testing whether these deals stack up from a bankability perspective, and whether there will be sufficient private sector interest to create a true competition. And I think that is a valid lesson that was learned from internationally that we can bring here.
Okay, thank you. And Debbie, for you, for this pipeline, is it going to convert in the next year or two into real investment projects, and what needs to happen to make that the case?
I think if it doesn't happen now, I can't see it ever happening.
Right.
Now should be the time it happens. Now's the time when everybody's talking about it. We've mentioned before this introduction of PPP laws. Either they've been introduced or they're being introduced.
We have the political will, don't we?
Well,
surely.
That seems to be the case. So I would be really optimistic that these opportunities would convert. I don't necessarily think it's going to be as quick as we might all want it to. I think, again, Richard, picking up on what you said about these things take time, and the best projects are not the ones which are rushed to market. They're the ones where there's been soundings, there's been thought, and there's a general appreciation before getting to the market as to what risks will be accepted, what will be passed on.
And so is your sense that we talk a lot about, and we have talked today about the legal frameworks and the institutional frameworks, is that the key bit, or is it the political will that you also talked about?
To me, I think it's really down to the nature of the project. How essential is it? Because we see a lot of projects being talked about, and some of them, frankly, are not as essential as others. And I think it's the ones which are essential and the ones which are well structured, which will get to market and which will be successful. When we were talking about the pipeline before and bottlenecks, it's going to be the ones which perhaps are the nice to haves, which I don't think will get through. And that comes down, I guess, to political will as much as anything else.
Thank you. Richard, we'll end where we started with you. So what's your prognosis then from over the next, let's talk about 2018. Are we going to see this pipeline converting into projects?
I tend to share the optimism of my colleagues here in terms of all the things that we've mentioned already. I think 2018 probably over optimistic. If you're looking at a well prepared, properly prepared PPP, and looking at a medium-sized project, because there's a lot of focus on these huge mega projects. They always take longer; they're more complicated. But a tender process, we're looking at 12 to 18 months would be a reasonable amount of time from decision to go and doing your own internal stuff to at least reaching commercial close.
Okay, so your sense is we have
right at the beginning
we've got
now.
The building blocks in place, but we're still
and we're starting.
Starting.
Governments are starting projects already, and they're starting tender processes. They're appointing advisors, but it's still right at the beginning. So. I think things will start to reach commercial close maybe 2019, 2020, start to reach financial close 2020 and beyond. And along the way, a lot of duff ones will be filtered out. Sometimes, you have to let the market decide at the end of the day. As an economist, I was always taught that, what's the price of something? Well, it's the price that's agreed between a willing buyer and a willing seller. Now, there are many willing sellers bringing stuff to the market. There may not be so many willing buyers, and you have to learn from those mistakes. And unrealistic expectations, again, things that we were touching on before. Sometimes, with the best will in the world, governments don't always listen to their advisors telling them stuff, and you have to learn by a project not working properly or not working as you wanted it to.
Okay, excellent. Well, that brings us to the end of today's broadcast. I'd like to thank our panellists, Richard, Debbie and Chris. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today and giving us your time and expertise. If you want to know more about the MEED's report, PPP in the Middle East and North Africa, you can contact me or my colleagues at MEED, whose details have been shown on screen. And finally, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Hopefully you found this broadcast informative. It will be available on meed.com on demand from 24 hours from now, and I look forward to seeing you at the next broadcast. Thank you very much.